Now, President Trump does have sky-high approval ratings amongst Republicans, often said to be around 80 to 90%. And also, as we know, he has very high approval ratings overall for how he's handling the U.S. economy. So, who, you might ask, would want to challenge the president in 2020 Republican primaries? Former Massachusetts Governor Bill Weld, that's who. He is the quintessential longshot and is worlds apart from Trump on practically everything. In fact, as a socially liberal, fiscally conservative candidate, it's hard to know where to place Weld in today's political landscape. And he's joining me now from New York to tell us why he's running and whether he thinks he can win. Well, I don't know, Governor Weld, welcome to the program. With that set up,
thank you.
Tell me, why have you chosen to run?
Well, I like to say that President Trump and I are two large orange men who have absolutely nothing in common. I really don't think the poor fellow is up to the job. He had absolutely no preparation for it. You were asking Senator Romney and Senator Murphy earlier whether you think we're coming to a constitutional crisis. It's obvious to me that President Trump is trying to provoke a constitutional crisis. He's not willing to really join issue and have any serious discussion about any of the issues generated by the Mueller report. You know, you had 400 federal prosecutors, former federal prosecutors yesterday, signing a letter saying that President Trump clearly committed obstruction of justice. And no one's even talking about that. All the president is saying is, we're not going to comply with any subpoenas because they're partisan. They're on one side and we're on the other. Okay, that is the path to a constitutional crisis.
Oh, well, let me just probe that a little bit now, because you are obviously, you have a long history of prosecutorial involvement and experience. You've had experience in the realm of impeachment. But this is what the Senate Republican leader, the leader of the majority in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, said about the Mueller report. Just listen to this for a sec.
They told everyone there'd been a conspiracy between Russia and the Trump campaign. Yet on this central question, the special counsel's finding is clear. Case closed. Case closed. This ought to be good news for everyone. But my Democratic colleagues seem to be publicly working through the 5 stages of grief.
Well, what do you say then? This is a Republican, the leader of the Senate of your party, the Republicans, saying case closed, while you did hear the previous senators, Murphy and Romney, saying that it will probably take the courts to close any case.
Well, I would begin by saying that 400 or 500 federal prosecutors yesterday disagreed with the Senate Republican leader's conclusion that the case is closed. They found that there was overwhelming evidence that the President of the United States did commit obstruction of justice. And I would suggest that the only reason that Mr. Mueller didn't seek an indictment for obstruction of justice is because Attorney General Barr told him that he would not permit that. So, and he outranks Mr. Mueller in the Justice Department. But if Mr. Mueller had had a free hand, I think he would have sought that indictment. And by the way, I was one of those 400 former federal prosecutors who signed that letter yesterday.
Well, let's get back to your challenging the president in the primaries. I mean, I said that you were a little bit of an outlier in today's political landscape, being socially liberal, fiscally conservative. Let's just put up a little graphic of some of the positions that you've supported when you were governor of your own state of Massachusetts. On abortion, supporting a woman's right to choose. On same-sex marriage, you support gay rights. On marijuana, supporting legalization. And, of course, when it comes to the climate, you support the Paris Accord. And added to that, the president is overwhelmingly popular. I mean, 80 to 90% of the Republicans support him. And, as I said, some 56% of the country supports his economic performance. What makes you think that you can, chip away at that?
Well, the polls also say that 54% of the voters in the country are definitely not going to vote for Mr. Trump in 2020. So that's not really a good start. I will grant you that Mr. Trump has the undying loyalty of the Republican state committee members in each of the 50 states because they were the Trump campaign. And the Republican National Committee and the Trump campaign is ordering them to fall in line. But if you think that closes the deal, you're really saying that the party bosses have to dictate the result of this election. And I think the electorate should be considerably broader than that. And I would mention that 20 states permit crossover voting where a Democrat or an independent can take a Republican ballot. So this is not going to be decided by the Republican state committees. And my position on issues such as climate change and the danger to the world from the melting of the polar ice cap if nothing is done to retard that warming process, that is a position held widely by millennials, by Gen Xers. They know that they're going to reap the whirlwind if nothing is done here. They know that they're going to reap the whirlwind from the deficit if nothing is done to cut the deficit. You may recall that I was rated the most fiscally conservative governor in the United States when I was in office in Massachusetts. We need an economic conservative in the White House, and Mr. Trump, frankly, has shown no sign of being an economic conservative.
You just raised on the issues what matters to what apparently is going to be the most significant voting bloc, and that is the millennials taking over from the baby boomers. I mean, just to be a little bit snarky, if I might, you're 73 years old. The president is also up there at 73 years old. How are you going to appeal to a rising, active, young population who want to vote on climate, who want to vote on income inequality, who want to vote on gender and all the other areas, let's say, of justice and equality? What's your message to them?
Well, Christiane, in my political career, I've always been fresh and minty, the uncola, if you will. And those positions that you mentioned that I took in the 1990s in favor of full gay and lesbian civil rights and marriage equality. I appointed the woman who wrote the opinion holding that marriage equality is constitutionally required, and I'm proud of it. And on that issue, I was 20 years ahead of my time. Everyone thought I was crazy. But, you know, millennials identify with people who can take positions like that. I've got 3 millennials in my house, so I know wherever I speak. And I think my point of view and their point of view dovetail rather nicely, rather than a point of view that decisions as to personal conduct should be made by a bunch of, you know, big white guys in Washington, D.C. who live 700 miles away.
Now, as a fiscal conservative, explain how you would, for instance, tackle this hurtling towards almost irreversible climate change, as the U.S. report says, as the UN report says, and now people are getting it and they're out on the streets, certainly the young people. And you've heard the Democrats who are in charge of Congress talk about a Green New Deal. I mean, some of it is going to take, whatever you want to call it, a carbon tax, a payment, some kind of way to disincentivize the use of fossil fuels. Where do you stand on the policy on climate change and what it takes to mitigate it?
First of all, the Green New Deal is somewhat over the top. What it has to say about energy and renewables, that's fine. But it also says no more oppression. Everyone has a guaranteed income. I mean, it's everybody's wish list thrown into one bucket. But on what to do on climate change, I think you rejoin Paris, you adopt standards for CO2 emissions in 2050 that are consistent with the standards agreed to by other industrialized powers. I do not believe, as Mr. Trump maintains, that the future of energy is coal and oil. That's ridiculous. The future of energy is renewables. It's wind and solar. We have a lot of hydro from Canada. And I myself believe that up to 25%, maybe even higher, of our base should come from nuclear power. The biggest reduction in CO2 emissions ever recorded was when France, I forget whether it's the 70s or the 80s, moved to these small nuclear plants to account for 75% of their energy now. And they've never had a problem, and we could have the same thing in the United States. I've traveled in a lot of wide open counties where people would love to have a nuclear plant. They're a very good, safe neighbor and a very major employer. But we got to get serious about the energy mix if we want to combat climate change. And I am serious about it, and I want to combat it.
I mean, I guess you'll have a bit of a task to convince people now of the safety, because this was, as you mentioned, in Europe, on the roll, nuclear power, until Fukushima and what happened with the tsunami in Japan. But clearly a lot of people are thinking about that, because it does what you say it does. But you talked about party boss. Okay, carry on.
I was just going to say, we don't have to build a humongous nuclear plant on a barrier reef, which is what happened in Fukushima. We can do it the way was done in Western Europe. And People have been saying for a long time, why don't they invent something that could create almost a limitless amount of power and has zero carbon emissions? They have invented such a thing. It's called the atom.
Right. Now, you said that it won't be local party bosses who decide. And yet your own state, the GOP party, has now decided winner takes all in the primaries, not, proportional representation. So that's probably a problem for you, potentially. And then, you did announce your candidacy in April 15th, but it sort of went unnoticed. President Trump is studiously avoiding you, no nicknames, no tweeting, no nothing. And even some, Republican colleagues are not quite clear that you've entered the race. How are you going to make a splash, Governor?
Well, if it's Republican colleagues in Washington, they are all whistling past the graveyard and saying, I'm happy, happy, happy. And a bunch of people in Washington in both parties really only care about one thing, which is demonizing the other party so they can scare their base into giving them so much money that they can get reelected. That's not my mindset. When I was in office, I was the national chairman of U.S. term limits. So I don't see the situation the same way office holders in Washington do. And I think what we need in Washington is a good dose of what I did in my 2 terms as governor, reaching across the aisle to the other party and getting solutions that work for all the people. I don't see that from this president, from President Trump. I see a lot of bravura, a lot of bragging, and I see, frankly, insecurity. I think that Mr. Trump, we now know from his tax returns that came out for a decade, in one sense, he's the biggest loser in the United States because he lost more money, according to the New York Times, than anyone else in the United States. So and he has a famous temper. When the Mueller report was coming out, everyone said, we fear the president's wrath. You simply shouldn't have a president of the United States whose head is so full of anger that he can't seem to focus on the substance of issues. And I think that is the case with this man.
Governor Weld, thank you very much indeed for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Christiane.
So.